The memo arrived on FBI Director Louis Freeh's desk on July 10, 2001, marked urgent. It was 16 pages long, meticulously detailed, and written by a field agent in Phoenix named Kenneth Williams. The subject line read, Zakaria Massoud Subra and Osama bin Laden. Inside, Williams laid out a chilling theory backed by months of investigation. Middle Eastern men with connections to extremist groups were enrolling in American flight schools in unusually high numbers, and he suspected they were preparing for a coordinated terrorist attack involving aircraft. Williams recommended immediate action. Cross-reference flight school enrollments nationwide, investigate the individuals he'd identified, and treat this as a potential national security emergency. The memo sat in an inbox at FBI headquarters for 63 days. Nobody acted on it. Nobody cross-referenced the names. Nobody investigated the flight schools. And on September 11, 2001, 19 men with pilot training, several of whom had been flagged in various intelligence reports, hijacked 4 commercial airliners and flew them into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and a field in Pennsylvania, killing nearly 3,000 people in the single deadliest terrorist attack in American history. The Phoenix Memo, as it became known, would later be called the most significant missed opportunity in modern intelligence history. But it wasn't alone. In the months before 9/11, the FBI had multiple warnings, multiple chances, multiple pieces of a puzzle that should have been impossible to miss. They missed all of them. This is the story of how the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world had everything they needed to stop 9/11, and failed anyway. To understand how catastrophically the FBI failed, you need to understand what they knew and when they knew it. Start with January 2000, 16 months before the attacks. 2 Saudi men named Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Midhar attended an al-Qaeda planning summit in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. The CIA knew about this meeting. They had the location under surveillance. They photographed the attendees. They identified al-Hazmi and al-Midhar as suspected terrorists with connections to Osama bin Laden's network. And then, inexplicably, the CIA watched as both men flew from Malaysia to Bangkok and then onward to Los Angeles. The CIA knew they'd entered the United States. They had their names, their photos, and their visa information. Standard protocol required the CIA to immediately notify the FBI when known terror suspects entered U.S. territory, because the FBI handles domestic intelligence, while the CIA operates internationally. The CIA didn't tell the FBI. Not in January, not in February, for 18 months. Al-Hazmi and al-Midhar settled in San Diego, enrolled in flight schools, rented apartments using their real names, got California driver's licenses, and lived openly in a city with a major FBI field office just miles away. They weren't hiding. They were listed in the phone book, and the FBI had no idea they were even in the country, because the agency that was supposed to warn them had decided the information wasn't important enough to share. While al-Hazmi and al-Midhar took flying lessons in San Diego, other pieces of the puzzle were appearing across the country. In May 2001, 2 FBI agents in the New York field office were tracking a Yemeni man named Ali Soufan, who had connections to the 1998 embassy bombings in East Africa. Soufan's investigation led him to believe that al-Qaeda was planning something major on U.S. soil, possibly involving aviation. He requested access to CIA intelligence about the Kuala Lumpur meeting because he'd heard rumors that important al-Qaeda operatives had attended. The CIA refused to share the information. They told the FBI agents that the meeting was unimportant and that the attendees weren't a threat. This was a lie. The CIA officers who denied the FBI's request knew exactly who al-Hazmi and al-Midhar were, knew they were in the United States, and deliberately withheld this information from agents who were actively trying to prevent a terrorist attack. Why? Declassified documents and subsequent investigations suggest the CIA was trying to recruit al-Hazmi and al-Midhar as informants and didn't want the FBI interfering with their operation. They gambled that they could flip two al-Qaeda operatives into becoming CIA assets, and they were willing to keep the FBI in the dark to protect that operation. It was one of the most catastrophically stupid decisions in intelligence history, and it was about to get worse. In July 2001, that's when Kenneth Williams sent his Phoenix memo. Williams was a counter-terrorist agent who'd been investigating Islamic extremists in Arizona. He'd noticed something odd. Multiple Middle Eastern men with no apparent career interest in aviation were enrolling in flight schools and paying cash for expensive pilot training. Some had connections to extremist groups, some had visa irregularities. When Williams dug deeper, he found that this pattern wasn't limited to Arizona. Similar enrollments were happening in Florida, California, and other states. Williams was a detail-oriented investigator who understood that patterns mean something. He wrote his memo to headquarters outlining his concerns and explicitly recommending that the FBI compile a nationwide list of Middle Eastern men in flight training programs and investigate their backgrounds. The memo reached headquarters and was assigned to a counterterrorism unit for review. And then it sat there. The agents who received it didn't consider it a priority. They had hundreds of other leads and tips flooding in daily. Flight schools seemed innocuous. The memo got filed away, no investigation was launched, no list was compiled, no follow-up occurred. If Williams' recommendations had been implemented, investigators would have immediately flagged multiple 9/11 hijackers who were at that moment training at flight schools in Florida and Minnesota. The attack could have been prevented with a few phone calls and database searches. Instead, the memo gathered dust while the hijackers continued their preparations. Then came August 2001, the final missed opportunity. A flight instructor in Minnesota named Clarence Prevost became suspicious of one of his students, a French-Moroccan man named Zacarias Moussaoui. Moussaoui had paid nearly $10,000 in cash for simulator training on commercial jets, but he had no aviation background and no clear career interest in flying. He was evasive about his background and seemed only interested in learning how to steer large aircraft in flight, not how to take off or land. Prevost thought this was bizarre and potentially dangerous, so he contacted the FBI. The Minneapolis FBI field office took Moussaoui's case seriously. They arrested him on immigration violations and began investigating his background. What they found was alarming. Moussaoui had connections to Islamic extremist groups, had received money from overseas sources linked to terrorism, and had been communicating with known al-Qaeda operatives. The Minneapolis agents believed they had stumbled onto something major. They wanted to search Moussaoui's laptop and phone records immediately, believing they might find evidence of an imminent terrorist plot. To get that search warrant, they needed approval from FBI headquarters. The request went to the radical fundamentalist unit at headquarters, where it landed on the desk of an FBI supervisor who would later be infamous for his role in the intelligence failure. That supervisor reviewed the Minneapolis request and decided it didn't meet the legal threshold for a warrant. He denied the request and told the Minneapolis agents to back off. The Minneapolis agents were furious. They believed they had a potential terrorist in custody and were being prevented from investigating him properly. The lead agent in Minneapolis sent increasingly urgent messages to headquarters warning that Moussaoui might be planning to hijack an aircraft. He used those exact words, hijack an aircraft. The headquarters supervisor dismissed these concerns as overreaction. He accused the Minneapolis agents of being overzealous and fabricating urgency. In one message, he told them they were trying to get people spun up over nothing. The Minneapolis agents were so concerned that they went around the FBI chain of command and contacted the CIA directly, hoping another agency might take the threat seriously. The CIA was interested. They started their own investigation into Moussaoui and quickly confirmed he had extensive connections to al-Qaeda operatives in Malaysia and Pakistan. But the CIA's investigation moved slowly. and they didn't share their findings with the FBI in real time because, once again, the two agencies weren't communicating effectively. Moussaoui remained in custody on immigration charges, his laptop unsearched, his communications unmonitored, while his co-conspirators continued preparing for the attacks. Later analysis would show that Moussaoui's laptop contained detailed information about the 9/11 plot, including contact information for other hijackers and details about target buildings. If the FBI had been allowed to search it in August, they would have uncovered the entire conspiracy with weeks to spare. By late August 2001, the U.S. intelligence community was receiving what they later described as chatter, increased communications among known terrorists suggesting something major was about to happen. The CIA's Counterterrorism Center was issuing warnings to senior officials that an attack was imminent.
On August 6th, President George W. Bush received a presidential daily brief titled Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S. The brief warned that al-Qaeda wanted to conduct attacks inside the United States and that the FBI had detected patterns of suspicious activity consistent with preparations for hijackings. But the brief was vague, offering no specific details about timing, targets, or methods. And critically, the brief was based on incomplete information because the FBI and CIA still weren't sharing intelligence effectively. The FBI didn't know that al-Hazmi and al-Mithhar were in the country. The CIA didn't know about Kenneth Williams's Phoenix memo or the Moussaoui arrest in Minneapolis. Each agency had pieces of the puzzle, but nobody was putting them together. This wasn't just bureaucratic inefficiency. This was systemic failure at every level of the intelligence apparatus, and it was about to have devastating consequences. On August 23, 2001, the CIA finally decided to inform the FBI that al-Hazmi and al-Mithhar had entered the United States. 19 months after the two men arrived in Los Angeles, someone at the CIA realized this information might be important to share with domestic law enforcement. The notification went to the FBI's New York field office, which immediately began searching for the two men. But there was a problem. Nobody knew where they were. Al-Hazmi and al-Mithhar had moved several times since arriving in San Diego. They'd left California and traveled to the East Coast. They joined up with other hijackers who'd entered the country on student and tourist visas. By late August 2001, they were in New Jersey, conducting final preparations for the attacks and staying in hotels near Newark Airport. The FBI agents searching for them were looking in the wrong cities, checking outdated addresses, and working without urgency because nobody had told them these men were part of an imminent threat. The search was methodical and slow. They had no idea they were in a race against time. On September 10, 2001, the day before the attacks, FBI agents were still generating leads and planning interviews, believing they had weeks or months to track down these suspects. They had 18 hours. The morning of September 11th began normally at FBI headquarters. Agents arrived at their desks, checked emails, reviewed case files. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Initial reports suggested it was an accident. A plane had somehow hit the building. At 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower, and everyone realized this was a coordinated attack. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 hit the Pentagon. At 10:30 a.m., United Airlines Flight 93 crashed in a field in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back against the hijackers. By 10:30 a.m., both towers of the World Trade Center had collapsed. Nearly 3,000 people were dead or dying. And at FBI headquarters, agents began pulling files and realized with growing horror that they'd had information about some of the hijackers. They found the Phoenix memo. They found the Moussaoui case file. They found the CIA notification about al-Hazmi and al-Mithhar. They found reports from field agents who'd flagged suspicious Middle Eastern men in flight schools. Every single piece of information that could have prevented the attacks was sitting in FBI files, unconnected and unanalyzed. The picture was complete, but nobody had been looking at it. The realization hit like a second wave of devastation. This didn't have to happen. In the days after 9/11, the FBI launched the largest investigation in its history, identifying the 19 hijackers and mapping their support network. What they found made the failure even more inexcusable. 15 of the 19 hijackers had entered the United States legally on tourist or student visas. Several had overstayed those visas and were technically deportable, but nobody had been tracking them. Multiple hijackers had been stopped by police for traffic violations in the months before the attacks. They were pulled over, given tickets, and released without anyone checking whether they were on terrorism watch lists. 2 of the hijackers had lived with an FBI informant in San Diego who'd been reporting on the local Islamic community. The informant had mentioned his Middle Eastern roommates to his FBI handler, but nobody thought to investigate them further. The hijackers had used their real names to book flights, rent cars, and open bank accounts. They hadn't been particularly careful or sophisticated in their operational security. They'd simply relied on the fact that nobody was looking for them. And that gamble had paid off because the FBI and CIA had failed at the most basic level of intelligence work, sharing information and connecting dots. The post-9/11 investigations revealed the full scope of the institutional failures. The CIA had violated its own protocols by not informing the FBI about al-Hazmi and al-Mifar. Multiple CIA officers had known these men were in the United States and had actively prevented FBI agents from accessing that information. Congressional inquiries later determined this wasn't mere incompetence, it was deliberate obstruction, likely motivated by the CIA's desire to run its own operation without FBI interference. The FBI headquarters supervisor who'd blocked the Mousavi laptop search was identified in congressional reports as having committed serious errors in judgment. He'd ignored urgent warnings from field agents, dismissed credible threat information, and created bureaucratic obstacles that prevented investigators from doing their jobs. After 9/11, he was promoted. The agent who wrote the Phoenix memo, Kenneth Williams, testified before Congress about how his warnings had been ignored. He described a culture at FBI headquarters where field agents' insights were routinely dismissed by supervisors who believed they knew better. He explained that the FBI's computer systems were so outdated that agents couldn't easily search databases or share information across field offices. The agency that was supposed to protect America from terrorism was using technology from the 1980s and organizational structures from the 1960s. The 9/11 Commission, established to investigate the attacks, issued a devastating report in 2004 that laid bare every failure. They found that the FBI and CIA had engaged in what they called a failure of imagination, an inability to conceive that terrorists would use commercial aircraft as weapons, despite multiple warnings suggesting exactly that scenario. They found that both agencies were plagued by structural barriers to information sharing that prevented them from connecting pieces of intelligence that, when combined, clearly indicated an imminent attack. They found that senior officials at both agencies had received numerous warnings about al-Qaeda's intentions, but had failed to treat the threat with appropriate urgency. The Commission's most damning finding was that 9/11 was preventable. They didn't use that word lightly. They meant that if the FBI and CIA had functioned competently, had shared information as they were supposed to, had followed up on credible leads from field agents, the attacks could have been stopped. The hijackers could have been identified, arrested, and deported. The plot could have been disrupted at multiple points. 3,000 lives could have been saved. But it didn't happen because institutions designed to protect Americans had become more concerned with bureaucratic turf battles, interagency rivalry, and career politics than with actual national security. The aftermath of 9/11 brought massive changes to American intelligence agencies. The FBI underwent the largest reorganization in its history, creating new counterterrorism divisions and upgrading technology systems. The CIA implemented new information sharing protocols. Congress created the Department of Homeland Security and the position of Director of National Intelligence to improve coordination between agencies. New laws like the Patriot Act expanded surveillance powers to prevent future attacks. But these reforms came at a tremendous cost. The intelligence failures of 9/11 enabled the worst terrorist attack in American history, which triggered 2 decades of war in Afghanistan and Iraq, cost trillions of dollars, killed hundreds of thousands of people, and fundamentally altered American society. Civil liberties were curtailed, surveillance expanded dramatically. An entire generation grew up in a post-9/11 security state shaped by the fear that terrorism could strike anywhere, anytime. And all of it traces back to those missed opportunities in the months before September 11th, to memos that weren't read, to warnings that were ignored, to dots that never got connected.
The human cost of these failures cannot be overstated. Nearly 3,000 people died in the attacks. Office workers, firefighters, police officers, airline passengers, and crew. Each one had a name, a family, a life that was stolen because the people tasked with protecting them didn't do their jobs. The victims included people who worked in the World Trade Center and had no idea they were working in a building that terrorists had been planning to destroy for years. They included firefighters who ran into collapsing towers to save lives. They included passengers on Flight 93 who fought back against hijackers and prevented their plane from reaching its target in Washington, D.C. None of them should have been in that position. If the FBI had acted on Kenneth Williams' Phoenix memo in July, if headquarters had approved the Moussaoui laptop search in August, if the CIA had told the FBI about El-Hazimi and El-Mithar in January 2000, the attacks never would have happened. The hijackers would have been investigated, identified, and neutralized before they could execute their plan. The towers would still be standing. Those 3,000 people would have lived. In the years since 9/11, some of the officials responsible for the intelligence failures have spoken publicly about their roles. The CIA officers who withheld information about El-Hazimi and El-Mithar have largely remained silent, protected by the agency's culture of secrecy. The FBI headquarters supervisor who blocked the Moussaoui investigation retired with full benefits and has never publicly acknowledged his mistakes. Kenneth Williams, the agent who wrote the Phoenix memo, gave interviews describing his frustration at being ignored and his belief that many lives could have been saved if someone at headquarters had taken his warning seriously. He died in 2011, reportedly still haunted by the knowledge that his memo could have prevented the attacks. The institutional failures that enabled 9/11 weren't the result of a few bad actors. They were systemic problems that had been building for decades. The FBI and CIA had evolved into bureaucratic empires, more concerned with protecting their authority than with protecting the country. Field agents who understood threats were ignored by headquarters officials who'd never worked the streets. Agencies hoarded information instead of sharing it. Rivalries between organizations took precedence over national security. And when the moment of crisis came, when all those chickens came home to roost, the system collapsed completely. Today, the FBI acknowledges 9/11 as the greatest failure in its history. The agency's headquarters building contains a memorial to the victims, and new agents are trained on the intelligence failures that allowed the attacks to occur. The Phoenix memo is studied as an example of what happens when field-level intelligence is dismissed by bureaucrats. The Moussaoui case is taught as a cautionary tale about letting procedure override common sense. But acknowledgement doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't bring back the dead. It doesn't undo 2 decades of war and societal trauma. The FBI had every tool they needed to stop 9/11. They had warnings from field agents. They had suspected terrorists under surveillance. They had pieces of the puzzle scattered across multiple field offices and databases. What they didn't have was the competence, coordination, and urgency to put it all together. And that failure, that catastrophic, inexcusable failure, cost nearly 3,000 lives and changed the world forever. This wasn't a failure of resources or technology or legal authority. This was a failure of the most basic intelligence work: paying attention, sharing information, and acting on credible threats. The worst intelligence failure in FBI history happened because the people who were supposed to be watching weren't looking, and the people who were looking weren't being heard. And when the towers fell, everyone suddenly understood what had been missed. But by then, it was far too late.